Alright, you're all locked in here with me now, so you gotta listen, right? My name is Ed Fagler. It says here on this big slide. And this talk is called Open Sourcing Mental Illness. And it really, I guess I want to talk a little bit about where it came out of. I do a podcast with a friend of mine, Chris Harchis, and we kind of talk about fun stuff, about development, doing stuff in PHP and other languages, and how much we hate everything and stuff like that. And it's a lot of fun, and usually it's kind of a jokey, enjoyable sort of thing. And last year, I was at a conference, and not the conference's fault, but I had this really, really horrible time. There were a bunch of different factors came together, and it was just a really uncomfortable for me, unpleasant experience. A lot of anxiety, a lot of upset, a lot of depression, and I think I thought about that for a couple of weeks and decided that I wanted to talk about it on the podcast and talk about what it was like and what it was like to go through that. And Chris was like, well, that doesn't sound funny, but I guess we could do it. And he was game for it, and was real supportive about it. And so we did this, and mostly it was just me kind of rambling about stuff that had happened to me in this place, and just in general, just how I'd struggled with mental illness for my whole life since I was a kid. And we really got this huge response from it. To this day, it's just by far the biggest response we got on that episode. And a lot of people wrote me and said how they'd been going through similar things, and they didn't, people didn't know about it, or only a couple of people knew about it, just like their wife or their husband or their kid, the kids didn't know, and they kept it private, and they were scared, how they had similar experiences to mine about anxiety and about feeling alone and feeling not like anybody else, and that everything was, that they just didn't work right, and things like that. So for a long time, I was blown away by that reaction, and I was trying to figure out what to do. I felt like I should kind of build on this a little bit, and I struggled with that for a long time because I didn't know what to do, and there were things I was good at, and there were things I was not good at. And what I guess I decided the best idea to do was just to keep talking about it. And so I started doing that, and this talk really comes out of that. I'm going to give it a couple other places, and I'm going to give it here, and I hope that you find it interesting. I hope that you find it useful. Whether you yourself struggle with mental illness, whether you know people who may, and afterwards we're going to have a little get-together, like a Birds of a Feather session. It's kind of based off this organization called Blue Hackers. And just kind of continue talking about stuff. So if you're into that, right after this, we're going to move over to the open space and talk about it a little bit. But tell you a little bit about myself. I'm just a dad and a husband and a developer type person. I like building stuff on the web. And occasionally I write music, and I'm kind of a big nerd. I collect video game consoles, like old video game consoles. Old computer stuff, like Atari STs and Amigas and Commodore 64s and things like that. I have a mental illness, or really I have a couple. And a couple things I'm going to talk about that. But I'm just here as a person. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm not trained in any way. I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'm just talking about it from my perspective and things I've observed about myself, and a little bit about what I've observed in other people too. But I'm just here to talk about this stuff. And so I'm not a doctor. You shouldn't necessarily you don't take any words I say as gospel. But I think that by talking about this, we can learn some things from each other. My diagnoses, I just found out the last two times I gave the slide that was misspelled. There was an extra N in there. It was my diagnoses, which was not good. But the first thing I have is a generalized anxiety disorder. That's the kind of thing I deal with mostly nowadays. And depression is kind of part of that. But basically, generalized anxiety disorder is just being too worried about stuff where there's not necessarily an obvious trigger for that. Like, an obvious trigger would be, I didn't pay my taxes for the last 3 years, and now I owe the IRS like $75,000. That would be something to be slightly anxious about. I will just be around and like be anxious about stuff and not know why. I just feel anxious. I have like physical symptoms of that anxiety. I tend to get more anxious about stuff that would otherwise be only mildly disconcerting for some people. Make them, I'm a little bit nervous about that. I can get really nervous about that. And it can be debilitating to the point where it's very hard for me to function, to interact with people normally, and things like that. I also have adult ADD, that's attention deficit disorder. I think I've had it longer than I've been an adult, but it was only diagnosed when I was 27. I was the kind of kid in school that I was fairly clever and smart, I guess, right? But there's a lot of different kinds of smart. I was really, really crappy at doing homework. In my high school, I had the small private school I went to high school for. That was actually really good for me in that situation. I had like a very small class. There was only probably about 25 kids. I had like the third lowest GPA and the third highest SAT score. And a lot of that's just because I really had trouble staying focused on things. I had trouble juggling a bunch of different things at once. Oftentimes I would experience problems where when I was working, I would not be able to focus for a long time, like a week. I wouldn't be able to get anything done. It was like I would just, read, news feeds for a week instead of actually getting anything done, stuff like that. I take some medicine for this stuff. Not everybody needs to. A lot of people do. But I want to talk about the medicines that I do take. And every day I have to take these things. The first one is I take a thing called Lexapro, which is an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. What that does is it basically keeps this chemical called serotonin that doctors think has something to do with feeling better and kind of feeling happy and feeling okay. And to keep that in your bloodstream and to keep it from being reabsorbed, it's released in your bloodstream and then not. That this keeps it. It kind of keeps it in there longer. SSRI is the first SSRI on the market was Prozac. Lexapro is like another generation of that. So it's similar kind of thing. Buspar is a medication that I take that helps with anxiety and also seems to help with the effectiveness of SSRIs. I take that twice a day, and it does help me some with my anxiety. It does seem to make me a little less depressed. Seems to calm things down. Strattera is a medicine for ADD. I think it's the only one, at least in the U.S. market, that you can use to treat ADD. That is not an amphetamine, and if you don't know what amphetamine is, that is speed. I did take an amphetamine for a while. So at first to try, because that's the standard thing that they give people about that. And kind of after a while, at first it makes you feel awesome because you don't feel like you have to eat ever, and you can talk really fast, and your mind goes feels like everything's really going well, and you're in a great mood. After a while, if you just take the same dose every day, over and over, which is how you're supposed to take it, for me it just kind of made me feel anxious, so I switched off of that, and I take Strattera, and that works okay. It helps me focus. It's not magic. It doesn't make me super attentive, but it seems like it's a little less inattentive and a little less scatterbrained. And then I take a thing called Klonopin, and Klonopin is a tranquilizer. It is a medication that's sort of similar if you've heard of something like Xanax or something like that. Klonopin I've also taken Xanax. Klonopin tends to take a little longer to kick in for me, and it sort of lasts longer. Xanax tends to work more quickly, but doesn't last as long, and I sort of don't like the way I feel when I come off of it, because I sort of feel anxious when I come off Klonopin is less like that. I kind of like it better. It works better for me. But for people who have anxiety issues, it's common that they would get a tranquilizer, and Klonopin is a very common thing to get. Or people who might have panic attacks or something, they might get Xanax because it acts faster. But yeah, those are the things that I take every day. I guess I wanted to talk some about kind of what it's like, what it's like to deal with this stuff. I think the thing that's hardest to deal with is this intensity of emotion that I feel. That I don't know if you ever. Everybody here have seen the movie Kill Bill? All right. Remember, when kind of starts playing that siren music in the background and like zooms in her face and she's about to looks like she's going to murder somebody. She's all prepared to kill. That is kind of what it's like sometimes. A thing that I think is hard for a lot of folks to understand, because it's not like this for them, is that they'll feel emotions, but they kind of feel like they are in control of them, like they can kind of deal with them and act normally and behave normally and kind of deal with that. And for me, a lot of times, emotions of frustration or embarrassment or anger are so intense that it makes me unable to interact with people normally or sort of like put on a good face or things like that. I'll need to, in some situations, I'll just be like, I have to leave the room because I can't really deal with the certain situation that's going on right now. The way that I feel, it's not really the situation, it's the emotion that gets triggered inside of me. And it's a lot like a wave, and I feel like I kind of have to ride it out. There's just nothing I can do about it until it dissipates. I don't know, I wish I did know how to just shut it off or stop it, or if there was some kill switch to cancel it. I wish there was, man. That would make my life a lot easier. But there's not a lot of times, and I just have to kind of deal with it. And a big problem with this intensity of emotion is sometimes it pushes me into a situation, particularly if it's a thing that has to do with anger or things like that. And you really, most of the time, anger is really driven out of fear or embarrassment for me. That's really the base of it. Is that it can put me in a situation where I don't really care about consequences, even though I'm very well aware of them. Consequences of how it might hurt me, how it might hurt my job, how it might hurt my family, how it might hurt the people around me. That when it's at its worst, I just don't care. I don't care about it. I'm aware of that, and I just don't give a shit. And that's a bad, bad situation to be in, and a very self-destructive situation to be in. So that's tough, but I have to deal with that, and I have to figure out how not to put myself in that situation. Anxiety, I talked a little bit about what it's like, but I think, like I said, you kind of feel more nervous and upset or anxious about things for no apparent reason, or if there's a reason, your reaction seems very extreme. A lot of times I have physical manifestations of it, and the thing that's most common for me is I feel a tightness in my chest that feels like a rope knot, like being twisted and pulled tighter and tighter. That's how it feels to me, right at the bottom of my sternum. A lot of people have different reactions to that. I used to have, how many people know what IBS is? Irritable bowel syndrome? It's kind of unpleasant. But I think for me, it was a lot of my anxiety for a long time manifested itself in that way. And so IBS is basically this, feeling like you just have to really go to the bathroom a lot, way more than normal. And of course that makes you nervous because you really would like not to shit your pants in public. That's something most people try to avoid normally. And you get a little anxious when that happens, and so that tends to feed into it too. And it got to the point where I don't know, but I wasn't exactly agoraphobic, but I was being away from a bathroom phobic. like to the point where I couldn't travel. It was really uncomfortable for me to do that. If I had to drive more than 15 minutes, it was extremely nerve-wracking for me to do that. So things like that gave me a huge amount of anxiety, because I was afraid that I'd have to stop or pull over on the side of the road or some crap like that. Crackling, no pun intended. Something a friend of mine said about this was, and I quote her here, is that I find the challenge to be explaining to folks how it's not like their anxiety about a job interview or about Mondays, that it's really debilitating and crippling, and they feel like you're not in control of it, and you can't do anything about it. That's what's really, really hard. I talked about having problems focusing, like with the medications, I think it looks a lot better. Maybe with age has helped some. But it used to be like at work, I'd go a week and wouldn't get anything done. Literally nothing. I think there are a couple different reasons for that, but it's a struggle, particularly if you don't have the other compelling reasons to keep you focused on stuff. Just doing that, and that's a really hard thing to do because you feel like you don't have any willpower. I mean, even though I think willpower is kind of a weird, difficult thing to define, and I think we expect a lot of it. But you can't just make yourself do stuff, and that's really hard. Another thing that I have a lot of issues with, and I think I see people talk about commonly, is these, what I call a spiraling chains of thought, where you think about one possibility and you can see 6 or 7 steps into the future really, really quickly to see some awful consequence. And of course, it's always an awful consequence. You can construct these negative outcomes really easily. Like, well, if this happens a lot when I'm going to fly, and it's like, well, what if I lose my phone somewhere? And then, if I lose my phone, I get stuck in the city, and because I don't know how to get back to the place, and then I miss my flight, and then I don't know how to get to the hotel, and I can't get in contact with anybody, and then somebody robs me, and then I end up in jail or homeless or something like that. That is not all that weird for me. The worst possible outcome, I tend to get there quickly in my mind, and it is hard for me to let go of it. I obsess on negative events a lot and negative possibilities a lot. Negative events, particularly things long in the past, even things long in the past, I find conflict really upsetting and uncomfortable. That kind of stuff really weighs on me. So if I've had a disagreement with somebody, or if I felt like something sort of went a weird way, that'll weigh on me. Just to tell you how old I am, hanging out in college on Usenet before the web was a thing. If I'd get in some sort of fight, like some flame war on a news group, man, that shit would stick with me. To the point where I couldn't sleep. It bothered me so much. Stuff like that. I was just constantly anxious and uncomfortable, and it was really, really hard to just let it go. It would take days and days to let it go, and it was just crushing. And it was just really hard to let go. Think about things long in the past. I still feel guilt. If I think of it, I still feel guilt about things that I did in 4th or 5th grade. And things that weren't even that big a deal, but stuff like I didn't do some homework or something like that. And how embarrassed I was when I had to tell the teacher that. And those are just things that they stick with you longer than they should, and they hurt more than they should, it seems like. Unwanted thoughts are, I don't know, I've developed some comfort level with having weird and inappropriate thoughts at the worst possible times, but I remember when I was 12 or 13, I went through this period where I was raised Catholic, and we go to church every Saturday or Sunday and all that. And I was also going to a Catholic school, so we also had to go to church on Tuesday, I think it was. And I was constantly afraid that I would think of something that was funny, of course funny to like a 12-year-old, and I would just start laughing in the middle of church. Like, and really inappropriate. And that's just, oh boy, you should not, you know, you have to be very solemn in a Catholic Mass. And that was not, you know, that was not appropriate to start laughing in the middle of it. So, of course, what would happen is, like, things would constantly be popping into my head, and I wish they would not, and I wouldn't want to, I want to go away, please don't, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, and I was terrified of even of being in situations where it was like, it's not appropriate to do something like that. Putting myself in that kind of situation, or being put in that situation, just scared the heck out of me, because I knew the whole time, it was like I was white-knuckling it through it, because I was like, you know, trying to hold stuff back. That's just a struggle. That thing seems to have dissipated for me, but I know there's still a lot of people have those kinds of things where it's like stuff that they don't want to think about just keeps occurring in their head or appearing in their head over and over, and they can't let go of it. There's a comedian, I forgot her name, but she was talking about like having thoughts like that about about church, like she was in church, like thinking about the most inappropriate things to go to church, like run up on the altar and poop on it and yell at everybody, or you know, things like that. It's just ridiculous stuff, right? And that stuff still follows her. It's like thinking the most inappropriate possible thing at the worst possible time, and not you can't like shut that shit off. It's just your brain just keeps firing this stuff at you. But I think the worst thing, I think the thing that's common between a lot of folks who have different kinds of mental illnesses, not just the things that I've gone through or I still deal with, is that you feel like you're alone and that there's not anyone else like you. And that you're just broken, you don't work right, and it's never going to get better. That it is a situation where you simply can't exist in society. And the way that other people seem to get by and deal with stuff, they all seem to be working fine, and they all seem to be getting through stuff okay, and you can't. And as a consequence, you feel like there's just no way this is ever going to be right. I don't know how to fix it. And I'm supposed to just be able to control it and power through, and people tell me just to calm down, or people just tell me to, you know, it's going to be okay, just try hard. I tell you that all the time. And it doesn't ever work. It never works. And that is a really, really shitty feeling. I think for me, and I think the thing that happens with a lot of people is you have thoughts that if you don't work, you eventually start thinking about, well, then why am I alive? But I should say, it's like suicidal thoughts and self-mutilation are really kind of two different things. I've had few instances. I've had a lot of suicidal thoughts, a lot less lately, but they call it ideation, where you think about doing things, like I think about, you know, having a gun and shooting myself in the head. I used to think about that a lot as a teenager. We did not have any guns in the house, but I would think about that a lot, just that process of putting my gun up to my head and shooting. So I had those suicidal thoughts a lot. I haven't done as much as a lot of some people I've known, but I still have scars from self-mutilation I've done. A scar on my hand here that I did when I was 13. I've got stuff that was, I don't know, probably the last 10 years on my arm here, as a prominent one. Got a scar on my knee that still hasn't gone away. But I've seen people with scars up and down their arms and legs who used to cut themselves. And for me, and I think for a lot of people, not just me, but for me, I think it was that I didn't know how to express what it felt like. How I felt inside, and how serious it was, and how intense it was. because I didn't feel like anyone could understand it or got it. And I think that I did that, and I did this stuff because that was a way of expressing that. And I wanted people to understand what it was like. And I just didn't know how else to do it. I didn't know how else to explain it. I think real suicidal actions for me, have been rare. So it's different. It's not cutting the back of your hand. But I've had a couple incidents where I've been in situations where I felt like I've come close. I've come close a couple times when I've been on this I guess you'd like to say a rage bender, and I had just left the house and stormed out and screeched the tires and drove away and was driving as fast as possible. And I just was this close to just pulling my car into a telephone pole or a tree, just ramming into it. And probably the worst time was, it was kind of the same kind of thing where I was so angry and frustrated and upset, I just didn't give a shit about the consequences anymore, I just wanted it to end. And I had a mouthful of pills and I barricaded myself in the bathroom. And the only thing that kept me from doing that was, at the time, my son had been born about a year ago, and I just couldn't leave him. And that was really it. I don't know if I'd be here without my son, because that gave me something that I couldn't just bail, because if I did that, what happens to him? But it haunts you, the way that feeling where you just feel with certainty. I remember driving on the road, it was bad, just in the middle of a bad emotional situation, a bunch of shit was going on in my life. And I was driving on a road, it was about an hour drive, and in the middle of it I just decided, and I just knew that in a year I wouldn't be alive, because I couldn't do this anymore. And I just felt there just wasn't any way out of it. I just didn't see any way out. So, that's pretty heavy, I know, and that makes me think of this cat. That's some heavy fucking shit. And I know this is kind of rough to talk about, but I think it's important to talk about. So sometimes I tell people that this is my spirit animal. And it makes me, it makes me feel a little better, but to try to transition that into something else, I want to talk about what it's like as a developer and how this fits into that, because that's a big part of what I live. And surprisingly enough, the way that my brain works actually has certain positives to it, which is a little, you think, what the hell are you talking about, boy? Yeah, there's a few things that I think are kind of positive about the way my brain works. Where I have this, I'm really good at matching patterns, I think. People's brains, human brains, are really good pattern matching machines, and I think I'm really good at it, a little better than some people. And I'm really good at taking patterns that I've seen before, existing patterns, and applying them to solve problems, and I can do that really quickly. And I can do that, I can start anticipating potential outcomes of doing different things quickly. That is where, if you are able to construct scenarios really fast, that's a good side of it. It's because I can construct this, particularly things where I can say, oh yeah, if we do X, Y, Z, what's the user going to feel about that? Or if I do X, Y, Z, how's it going to affect our security or things like that? And I've found that I seem to anticipate that stuff sooner than a lot of people do. That's kind of helpful. And I think the other big thing for me is just being able to be empathetic and supportive to colleagues and to friends and stuff like that. And that's really valuable to me. I get a lot of reward and a lot of good feeling and a lot of positivity out of helping other people. And that's why I keep doing this stuff. That's why I keep doing open source stuff. That's why I keep doing web development, because I really like that. I like that aspect of building something and knowing that it helps somebody do something. or I help them learn how to do it themselves, or, you know, that's just really awesome, and I really, really like that. So I find that super rewarding, and I think that comes directly from just the way that I am. I'm not sure I have a great explanation for it, but that really helps, and I think that empathy that I feel like I have it's hard sometimes because it hurts more, but I think it helps me help other people more. As a developer, like, working with teams can be hard sometimes. In-person versus remote, a lot of times. I work a lot remotely, and, well, pretty much all remotely now. And remote stuff is hard sometimes because if all your communication is being done over text, it's hard to interpret stuff and interpret tone and things like that. And my tendency is to assume the worst tone possible in all situations. So I tend to take offense more easily and stuff like that, and I think that's kind of tough. Sometimes I've butted heads with people because of that, and that's hard. And it's something I'm not very proud of. I know that it's more difficult working with me because of that, and that's frustrating for me as much as I'm sure it's frustrating for everybody else. But that's something that kind of it goes with, and I just work on it every day. One of the things I find is that even though I work remotely, I have to avoid working alone, like on my own in an isolated place for long periods. Even though I have a very nice and pleasant house, I don't like being alone there and working. It puts me in a weird state. It makes me anxious and jumpy and generally not comfortable. And so I usually try to go out to a coffee shop, or if there's like a co-working space around, I try to go to the co-working space, because just being around other people makes me feel better. So for me, that's something that helps a lot. It really helps to have managers or bosses who are very, very understanding of this stuff, and are, who can help calm you down, who help you feel safe, feel okay, and less pressure, and that stuff really helps me. So when I've got that helps a lot. Interacting with users is always interesting. I just put down here, users are sometimes your worst enemy. Sometimes it can be really hard, and I think a lot of people take criticism to heart when they put something out there they've made, and it's kind of hard to hear shit. I think my problem is I actually have to actively not listen to users' feedback, because somebody else just has to do that on the team, and I have to block myself off from it. I'll get into that in a bit, but it's because it just hits me so hard that it really frustrates me. A lot of stuff that you do with particularly open source stuff, you talk on IRC, or you talk on forums and things like that, and I think a lot of that suffers from the same kind of thing. First off, of you're not having any kind of tone to work with, and then the way I tend to take stuff is I tend to take it a little more negatively, criticism-wise. The second thing is I think is frustrating is that I think via these kind of forums, especially these text-only forums, I think people often don't have their own senses of empathy triggered and thinking about that they're talking to another human being who has feelings and stuff like that, and they tend to be kind of, for lack of a better word, selfish and self-centered and only thinking about sort of the impact of stuff. I guess the thing I draw on is, how often is something I've seen that's just really fucking rude that somebody posts, and thinking about, could that person say that if they were just standing there? And the way that we interact and the way that we feel concerned about what we're saying and how we're saying it and how that affects another person, we seem to lose that when we have different kinds of communications not face-to-face. And so I struggle a lot with that because I take that shit personally. And I shouldn't, and I know I shouldn't, and I should really try hard, but I still do. And so that's a real struggle for me. Conferences and community stuff. That stuff, I love it. I love the feeling of being able to learn with each other and share and meet new people and learn new stuff. And I think all that stuff's great. But a couple things for me that are kind of tough sometimes, if you're a person who goes to more than 1 or 2 conferences a decade, I don't really like loud parties with lots of alcohol and stuff like that. And it's really not necessarily the alcohol, but it's the loudness that seems to come along with it and all that stuff that's associated with it. That's just kind of not my scene. I lose energy quickly being around large, loud crowds, and it's not very fun for me. And so one thing I really appreciate is when conferences or any kind of organization thing, they at least have an alternative. It's like maybe you could have something that's a little more low key or something like that. And I really appreciate that a lot when they do that. The other thing for me is that travel gets me really anxious because I'm very afraid that I'm going to not do a certain thing and that I'm going to get screwed. Because it's one of those things where if you forget one document, you can miss your flight and everything gets screwed up. And oh my God, this is the worst thing in the world. So I get a lot of anxiety about travel. It's funny though, once I do it, I'm sort of used to it and I'm okay, but then I'll not travel for 4 or 5 months and then I'm nervous again next time. And I start getting a few days before I'm just fucking jumpy the whole time and I feel anxious and my stomach hurts. And it's just not fun. So having to travel around a lot is sort of sucky for me, but it's better if I'm in the middle of doing it a fair bit. That helps. So we don't have a ton of time here, but I want to talk about some techniques that people use. I use some of them. Some of them work, some of them don't. For me, but I think they vary a lot. I think most of us would get into to step off, and I think this is a thing I've thought about a lot. That most of us self-medicate in some way. I think that the things we eat, and the things we drink, and the things we take into our body, and the things we do with our body, all of those things have an impact on our mental state as well as our physical state. And those things are deeply, deeply intertwined. I think, like I said, I think most of us self-medicate on some level, and I think probably something like alcohol is probably the most common thing. I think lots of people self-medicate for if they're stressed out, they might take a drink or something like that. And for some people that works fine, they have that every once in a while, it's not a big deal. And I think we use socially acceptable tools like food and drink and tobacco, things like that to regulate our mood. Drink coffee to try to be more awake and prepare for a certain situation. We might, if we're down, I know cook chocolate does that for me. So I tend to, I need something chocolate. I need a nice piece of dark chocolate with sea salt in it, and that will make me feel 10 times better when I'm in a shitty mood. And there's chemical stuff that goes into that I know a tiny bit about. It's kind of a side point, but I really strongly feel that most illegal drug users are just self-medicating. They have some struggles with mental illness that they're self-medicating, and they found that's the way that they cope with it. And it gets them into really shitty situations because it's fairly destructive. But what they're doing is they're coping with some other issue. My tendency is I tend to self-medicate with food, and that's why I'm not really skinny. So I really like things like ice cream and chocolate and peanut butter and stuff like that. Keith, you're just in time to talk about peanut butter. Okay. But yeah, that's what I do, and I struggle with that. I go back to my hotel room last night, it was a struggle not to go and be like, I think I'm going to go down to the lobby and buy a pint of ice cream and eat the entire thing. Because that's just kind of what I do, to make myself feel a little better. And that's why I do it. If it didn't make me feel better, I wouldn't fucking do it. I certainly wasn't hungry. It wasn't a practical thing. But it made me feel awesome when I do that. So, yeah. But realistically, getting into stuff I think has been more effective for me. I talk a lot about therapy, and when people often come up to me and talk to me about their particular situation and then what they're going through, and basically ask me, what should I do? The thing I always try to emphasize for them is I think that going to a therapist, somebody to talk about your problem and try to figure out what the root of the problem is, it really needs to be your first step. you know, depression or anxiety or things of this nature, they're conditions, but they're, I think in most cases, a symptom of other things that are going on. And there's a tendency, I think, on the part of, and a classic thing that most people do is they'll go to their general practitioner and they'll talk about their mood being down, or talk about anxiety issues and things like that. And the general practitioner, because this is the way that person is trained, will give them a common SSRI or some anxiety stuff like a tranquilizer or something like that, and then that'll kind of deal with that. But in that case, that really hasn't delved into why this is happening. What it's dealing with is it's treating the symptoms, and you know, in some cases, it treats the symptoms and the things go away. Maybe really what was going on was there was some temporary emotional thing that was going on, or like a severe amount of stress or something like that, for one reason or another, and that goes away. That's fine, and it helps them cope with that. And that, I would call that a success in the sense that it helped them deal with it better. But I think that, you know, lasting depression, lasting anxiety, or things like that is really typically a symptom of some other emotional trauma or some kind of physical condition that, you know, whether it's just, well, my brain just works differently and it doesn't have the chemical processes are a little different than normal, or I have some other issue, another medical issue that maybe is causing that. I mean, people talk about, we're talking about fibromyalgia, which is how people who have, or anyone else who's in chronic pain, well, depression tends to go along with that. And I'm not sure why that would be a surprise, because if you're at, like, on a scale of 10, if you're in an 8 chronic pain, like, all day, you'd probably be a little bummed out, because that really fucking sucks. And that is why, you know, some things like Cymbalta or something like that you use to treat fibromyalgia is also an antidepressant, and it treats that too. Those things tend to go together, but realistically, why is that person depressed? Well, maybe because their quality of life sucks, or maybe because they have enormous stresses on all the time, things like that. And I feel like if the first thing that you do is you just go to a gen practitioner and they give you a medication and that's how you deal with it, that's not really trying to figure out what the problem is. This varies for different people, and that can be successful for some folks, and that's fine, and it works out for them, and everything's good. But I guess I really feel like if you're really trying to solve the problem and figure out what's going on, you need to take an active role, and that's going to somebody who is a therapist who's going to work with you to try to figure that out. So, to try to figure out what emotional or physical or whatever issues are going into this to try to find the root. Obviously, I talk about a lot of people take medication, and that's helpful for them. It's helpful for me. Exercise is helpful in the sense that endorphins are super awesome at making you feel better. Stuff I've read is that exercise doesn't necessarily, like, long-term, like, eliminate chronic depression or things like that in people, but I will say that even if I just get outside and I walk enough where I feel like I've exerted myself, there is a difference. And I think it's for me, I kind of think it's probably just the release of endorphins, where if you hit a certain threshold of exertion, you get there. That just helps a lot. So if you're the kind of person who feels compelled to exercise, I typically do not, although I wish I did, that does help me a lot, and a lot of people get a lot out of that. Some people meditate and pursue meditation. I'm not good at that. I've tried it, and it sort of works, and it doesn't for some people. But some people have great success with it, and so I wouldn't knock it. I'd give it a shot. Light therapy is an important thing. I don't know if I have what's called seasonal affective disorder, but I know it's the case that if I go outside and the warmth of the sun on a nice day makes me feel a hell of a lot better from being inside. It just does, and I don't know, it does for me. And the flip side is if I'm not around the sun for a long time, I feel kind of crappy, and my anxiety is worse and stuff like that. There's people who have had a lot of success with light boxes, and there's real science behind it that if they do this, It really does improve their mood if they are around a certain kind of light for a certain period of time every day, and that helps a lot of people. I think avoidance of triggers is important. I talked about how, like, I just don't do user interaction, like handling feedback from users, because I'm just not capable of handling it in an appropriate way. A lot of times I find that I need to just shut things off for a while because I will obsessively check them otherwise and like look for something, especially if I'm very upset about something. I use my SEO file on my computer and just block things, like I will block Twitter, I'll block Facebook, or I'll block different kinds of things because they make me mad and I don't want to be mad. And that's not really the fault of the services, that is the fault of the way my brain works. And that's just how I have to deal with it. But it works. It usually keeps me from doing that shit, so that's helpful. I think crying is something that is wildly underrated in a lot of cases. For me, particularly anger is often, it's a reaction to fear and anxiety that I have. And what I often find is that I'll hit a point where if I just cry, it relieves that and it releases that. I think it's really, like I said, I think it's underrated. I think we're afraid to cry. I think men particularly. But I think it's really, really important because I think that's a way, I don't really understand it, but to me it feels like a way for my brain and body to deal with overwhelming emotion and let that shit out somehow. And that, it works for me. And finding comfort in things, finding comfort in stuff like certain kinds of clothing makes me feel better. I intentionally don't listen to like most tech podcasts because I don't want to think about that. It'll get me worked up about stuff. I listen to like sports radio or some other podcasts, like a comedy podcast or something like that. Talking to people you know that you can trust and that you know you can find who calm you down and comfort you and understand. Having those kind of people around you and reaching out to them, I think is really important. And hugs. I'm a big fan of hugs. Hugs do really good things for me. They make me feel a lot better. I think it's important to ask people before you hug them. But it really, I feel like there are fewer good expressions of bonding with a person and empathy between one another than a hug. And that means a lot to me. And it really does make me feel better. So I want to talk for a couple minutes real quick about sort of helping friends and coworkers. I think it varies for everyone. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I think there's a couple things I want to highlight. If you have somebody who maybe you're working with or something, you're on a team in some way, and who maybe struggles with some stuff like this, I think the first thing is key is to help them feel safe. Listen to them and really try to understand what it's like for them, because they probably feel like nobody is like them and that nobody understands. And really make an effort to say it's safe to talk to me, it's okay to talk to me, and I will not tell you what to do, I will not judge you, I will not say that you're just not trying hard enough. I will just listen to you and I will understand to the best of my ability. And that's just massively helpful, and I don't get that enough. Because I think people want to help. And I think people want to give you a solution, but most of the time you're really not in a position to understand what it's like, and you're not an expert on it, and maybe they don't need a solution, they just need somebody to understand them. Understand that they're probably really, really, really frustrated, and they're aware, particularly as it impacts their work, they're probably very aware of how it impacts their work, and that they're not doing a good job, or they feel like, I should say, maybe even if they are doing a good job, if they're an awesome worker, they probably feel like they're not doing a good job, and they're not productive, and they suck, and they're holding everybody back. I know I feel that way quite a bit, even now, when I've been in this business for too long. So, they are very frustrated with how they feel and how they behave, and they don't like it, and they wish it wasn't like that. So, that's something to remember. And that change particularly can scare a lot of people. And for folks particularly who have a lot of issues with anxiety or depression, change can be terrifying. Not just like, I don't like that. Like, I don't want to get out of bed. Debilitating kind of scared. It's really hard for a lot of us, but when your emotions are that extreme, it is really, really hard to deal with that. So, like, I remember a situation where they were talking about doing a retreat, and it was going to be in some place I've never been before. I was out of the country, this is for work, and everybody was excited about it. And I thought I was going to shit a brick, because I was terrified. I'm still terrified of going outside of the country. And just because I had a lot of travel anxiety, and I had to go up to a trusted guy who I feel really strongly about, and he was able to help me and say, no, man, it's okay. If you can't do it, it's fine. You're going to be okay. Don't worry about it. It's cool. And that was just massively helpful for me. Just if when you're going through change, when it happens, just go. If you know you're a person that struggles with this, go to them, maybe privately, and ask them how they feel and what they need. What would help you get through this better? How can we help? And that really helps a lot. So we're going to quickly go through a couple of resources. No one run late here. There's a couple of links here. I'm going to put these slides online. There's a couple things I want to highlight. DevPress.com is a forum, particularly for developers who struggle with mental illness. It's been started just a few months ago. I think it's a cool resource. There's a couple of things here I've added recently. A couple things like Patients Like Me that helps you deal with health, not all sorts of health issues. Mood Scope is a thing that kind of helps you track your mood and graph it, and other people can follow it. You can trust the people and say, yeah, I want my friends to kind of know that in some way that they can know like how you're feeling that day. Super Better is actually sort of like a gamification thing to deal with things like rehabilitation, recovery, dealing with health issues and stuff like that, which I think is kind of cool. And then a podcast that I found really helpful is called the Mental Illness Happy Hour. It's done by a comedian whose name I forget right now, Paul something. And they also have a forum that's really good, mentalpod.com/forum. Some of that stuff's pretty heavy, but I think it's pretty cool. And I've learned a ton about it. There's two more things I want to say. First off, if you like this talk, please give me feedback. If there's things you didn't like and you want to hear more about or something like that, go to Join In and give me feedback. And then right after this, I'm going to move to the Open Spaces group, the section, and we're going to have a Birds with Feathers session based on this. A couple of sessions have been done based on the bluehackers.org group. We're going to do it right after this. I'm going to walk down there past the other room. And if you want to keep talking more, it's going to be a private conversation that we can have together and to share stuff and learn from each other. So that's what I got for you. So thanks for listening. If you have more questions or something, at any time you can just grab me if I'm around. I'd encourage you to come to the session we're going to do. But if you're not comfortable with that, just hit me up. If you can't get me face to face, just talk to me some other way. And I'm happy to answer email. Thanks.